This is Adva Saldinger, and welcome to This Week in Global Development. Dave, Colum, thanks to both of you so much for joining me today. I know we have a lot to discuss. This week at Devex has been what we call Pro Week, with a lot of really great content for our Pro subscribers, in addition to all the content we've bring every week. And I think a lot of these stories have allowed us to dig pretty deep into some key issues in the industry. And so I'm excited to speak with both of you about some of those issues. Colin, I want to maybe start with you. I know one of the things you've been following quite closely is all the conversations around UN reform and sort of this UN80 effort. And you wrote a piece this week for us about that. And both how these efforts are aimed at efficiency and sort of changing the institution, but also about trying to ensure that there aren't sort of deeper funding cuts from the US and to try to kind of keep the US on board. What can you tell us about sort of the, three major work streams that you write about? What is the focus of this effort? What do people need to know about it?
Yeah, so I mean, reform, is a perennial issue at the U.S., at the UN, and there seems to always be an ongoing reform, and this is the latest one, and it's largely driven by, the U.S. The climate in Washington, and the U.S. kind of withdrawal from parts of the international system. So basically, earlier this year, the Secretary General tried to get ahead of this issue. At the time, we were seeing a lot of the voluntary funded agencies like IOM and others taking major hits to their funding, letting off thousands of workers. At the UN and headquarters, a lot of the funding is it's assessed. Governments have to pay that. So a lot of these issues were put off till the end of the year when they had the elections. So, I mean, not the elections, but the negotiations on the budget. So that hasn't entirely played out yet. So UN80 is an effort to kind of inform those budget negotiations. And as you mentioned, there are three kind of basic parts to it, work streams. The first ones is things that the UN can do that the Secretary General has the power to do, hiring freezes, maybe letting, unnecessary leases for buildings in Manhattan expire, other things like that, turning down the air conditioning. The much more serious reforms and efforts that cut funding would involve involves a mandate review, which is the second part. And essentially, going back to the founding of the UN, there have been sort of more than 40,000 mandates that have been issued to the UN to carry out. These are, resolutions in the UN Security Council's decisions, resolutions in the General Assembly that instruct the UN to do things. And there's a feeling that over the years, that every time they come up with a new mandate, it often overlaps previous mandates. And so there's concerns about duplication. So that's a key issue that he's pursuing, but that is an issue that will require member state approval. So the Secretary General can make the proposal, but then the member states will have to hammer it out. And this is an area where previous reforms in the history of the UN kind of run into trouble, where, you have, there's no reason to believe that the rest of the membership is just going to roll over and accept a reform that they see as a product of the U.S. Financial pressure. So we'll expect those to be quite contentious. And then the final work stream is like broader structural reforms of the UN system. Could involve merging agencies like the World Health Organization, UNAIDS. I mean, that's not on the table right now, but those are the kinds of issues that we're talking about. Again, that would require approval by UN member states, by executive boards of a lot of the UN agencies, which operate largely independent to the UN Secretariat. So that's all happening. It's generating a lot of pushback from staff, and also a feeling from a lot of experts on the UN that this is all just focused on cutting funds and not really kind of focused on, it's not really driven by a vision of how to make the UN kind of more efficient. It also coincides with a push, an austerity push by the Secretary General, which is really part of UN80, even though they say it's not part of UN80. And that involves large-scale cuts, an effort to bring down spending by up to 20%, by reducing staff in the Secretariat. There are about 30,000 staff, bringing down staff by 15, 20%. So that's kind of where we are. And we're all kind of now waiting for the member states to start taking it up in the budget negotiations.
How much of this do you think would have come about sort of naturally at this 80-year mark? I think, as you said, these discussions are sort of perennial about how to make the UN better. How much of it is driven by sort of the current US administration and the pressures that they're putting on the agency?
So I don't honestly know the answer to that. And I think if you were to ask sort of officially the UN, they might sort of suggest that these are things that have been in the air and, they were planning to do anyways. But it certainly feels like a sort of a hasty kind of panicked effort to address these concerns about really deep cuts. We spent the last couple of years really focused on, separate UN reform track, the Pact for the Future, a kind of more forward-looking negotiation or reform package. And that seemed that was going to, that was going to form part of Secretary General Antonio Guterres's legacy. Looking forward, how does the UN position itself in a world kind of dominated by artificial intelligence, other, issues, related to the digital landscape. And that seemed like that was his reform. And then this felt like it came out of the blue a bit. So I presume, my suspicion is that it is very much directly related to what's going on in Washington.
One of the pieces that I worked on that we published this week is a look at World Bank reforms, where I think also around World Bank reforms and the broader multilateral development bank reforms, there was really agreement across a wide range of countries on sort of the direction that things should go. Early on, a lot of the World Bank reform was actually driven by the previous US administration, but last year at the G20, there was this roadmap for MDB reform that was put forward, and that was sort of the agreed upon sort of set of standards. And we have seen sort of a shift in some of the priorities at the bank. And certainly some of the reforms towards efficiency have moved forward. We've seen sort of proof of that. One of the big things that Ajay Banga talked about is really speeding the time for project approvals, and that has dropped from 19 months to about 13 months. And so we have seen, some concrete sort of efficiency reforms happening. But when you think about the bank's sort of early evolution roadmap, which is what they called it, a lot of it was focused on shifting to, not only focusing on poverty, but on climate and a number of other things. A big piece of it was also stretching their own balance sheets, and the bank has done that. They're finding ways through various innovative financing instruments, but also by changing sort of the way they account for risk to lend more. But one of the interesting things that I found in doing this reporting is that while they now have sort of a lower threshold so they can lend more, they're actually not taking advantage of that full space that they have made by changing their risk policies. So it'll be interesting to see how they change that in the years ahead. But there's certainly been, I think, some significant impacts there too on sort of the agenda, how they're talking about things, really a push on talking about jobs and, economic, commercial relationships and things like that, that I think have been driven by the administration. And I think for some, as you say, sort of in the UN process, there's a feeling that there was, kind of a clear direction. So what's going to happen now? And one of the conversations I had for that story was interesting because it was with Kevin Gallagher at Boston University. And one of the things that he said is, look, there's a really interesting opportunity on sort of this MDB roadmap for non-Western backed MDBs to really take the lead on innovating around some of these things. And he called out specifically the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and we had a story from Jesse this week on AIIB at 10 years and sort of looking at some of the potential challenges ahead, but also some significant opportunities there just by the nature of the fact that they're not constrained by sort of a US policy agenda, but interesting other sort of things at play there, being a MDB based in China. And I want to come back to this issue at the UN and China, because I think you had another story this week, column, really looking at what China is pushing for at the UN, particularly on sort of hiring and having sort of more staff at the UN. I think, Dave, I'll come to you in a few minutes to talk also about sort of how the broader landscape is changing, and how China is playing a role in that. But just on the UN column, tell us a little bit about what you've seen China sort of pushing for in terms of staffing,
Right.
and how that's playing out and being received.
So one of the things that all governments do at the UN, they devote a lot of effort in trying to get jobs for their nationals, right? And so the US does that, China does that. But what's different this year, particularly, is that China, I mean, I've talked to a number of very senior, officials and others. And in conversations with the Chinese are being quite explicit, are not being subtle about it. And they're making the case that that they're underrepresented, which the United Nations recognizes that they're underrepresented. The US, by the way, surprisingly, is also, according to UN calculations, underrepresented, but that's a different issue. So, but what they have been making the case is they're saying, look, the US is pushing through this reform. They're trying to cut back funding. They're doing all these other things. We're paying our bills. They're not necessarily paying them on time. They pay them late, but they do pay the bill. Their share of the budget has gone up quite dramatically, and I don't think a lot of people realize this. For years, the U.S. has always been the largest contributor to the UN budget, but Germany and Japan, who are like number 2 and 3, are now a fraction of that, and China is now assessed, I think, 20% of the regular budget and over 23% of the peacekeeping budget. So they're starting to approach the Americans. They've become the second largest contributor, and they're starting to approach the Americans. The Americans, I think, pay 22% of the budget for the regular budget, and somewhere north of 25, so 27% of the peacekeeping budget, even though Congress has placed a cap at 25%. So we refuse to pay part of that budget, which is adding to a lot of the U.S. kind of arrears that we owe to the UN, which is over $1 billion. So, the Chinese are saying, look at the Americans, they're irresponsible, we're responsible, we need more senior jobs. Sort of quietly over the last year, also what China has been doing is making probably more aggressive in an effort than the U.S. to try and introduce kind of entry-level positions for Chinese nationals. So there's 2 basic programs, internships. I think it was 2023 was the last year, over 700 Chinese nationals are serving as interns. The Americans are the second largest with over 500. The other pathway to get into the UN is a program called Junior Professionals Officers, and people don't pay much attention to it, but basically it's a program whereby a member state will pay to cover the cost for an individual to serve in, kind of a professional capacity at the UN. And usually this is a stepping stone into a staff job. A lot of countries use these programs to try and promote candidates from other countries. So maybe a wealthy, European donor will do it for someone in the global south. But the Chinese are pretty much focused on Chinese nationals. And so they have something like 70, JPOs. The Americans have 26. So they're finding a lot of ways to get people into key positions. A lot of them are stuff that you don't really pay attention to, auditing boards, panels, that sort of thing, not really high profile. From Washington, a lot of this effort is viewed very suspiciously as an effort of the Chinese to kind of take over the international system and replace the United States. A lot of people who track this don't think that China really has that extreme an ambition to sort of replace the Americans as the key player in the international system because of the responsibilities, the cost, the political pressure to succeed may be too high and they may not be ready for it. But that, gradually they're looking for opportunities to increase their standing. And I think at the United Nations, there's a kind of recognition that, well, yeah, they're paying most of the bill, like almost most of the bill now. and they are underrepresented, and we need to take their, their demands and appeals seriously.
I think it's such a sort of clear example of, really how the aid landscape is changing. Because as you say, the amount that China has had to contribute to the UN has gone up quite considerably. And China clearly is I don't even know if you can call them emerging anymore, but a very significant player in the global aid landscape. And Dave, I wonder if we can turn to you. We had a couple pieces this week. One talked specifically about sort of emerging donors, talking about China and the Gulf. And I wonder what you can tell us about how those donors are contributing to a changing aid landscape and what sort of approaches they're taking that might be different to what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I think what we're really seeing, what Colin's been painting a picture of, is a kind of a move from a kind of unipolar world in the 1990s and so on and so forth into a very multipolar world now, where we're seeing China emerging as a kind of rival for the United States as the most powerful kind of entity in the political sphere, and we're seeing the emergence of other kind of nodes of wealth around the world outside of the traditional global north in the United States and in Europe. And arguably Europe is struggling a little bit right now. It's assailed with all sorts of problems, whereas the Gulf in particular is really emerging as it's always been wealthy, but it's been wealthy and quite insular. And now Gulf states are flexing their muscles much more and really applying themselves to kind of carve an outer space in the world order. So what we're seeing from a lot of these powers is the development of a kind of donor program similar to that which has previously been the purview almost entirely of kind of the traditional global north. We don't really know how much China is contributing overseas because it's not doing aid in quite the same way that we're seeing ODA emerging. It's quite hard to compare the Belt and Road Initiative and kind of quite a widespread loan program from China to I don't think it's usually a very good idea in general to compare,
like grant-based assistance, right?
Yeah,
it's quite
to compare
different.
grant-based assistance and loan-based assistance. There's no easy method to effectively compare the two of them. The situation in which you'd rather have a large loan to a small grant, sometimes you'd rather have one, sometimes you'd rather have the other. It's very unclear. I don't think even the ODA system itself has kind of really cracked how we compare loans to grants. And looking at the Belt and Road, which is obviously a multi-billion-dollar program. I think I would have to check the exact statistics, but I think over $120 billion of Belt and Road finance in 2024. How confident we are in that number, I don't entirely know either, but that's obviously real money. And then an interesting point in Arnatt's article was this idea that the West has been trying to really portray China as a kind of predatory lender, that it's lending in very poor terms. Sometimes I think that's true, but I think the general argument from the Global South is that is overblown. That's at least in part down to the United States and Europe wishing to portray China as a bad actor because they're rivals, and they just want to paint a picture of them being the good guys and China being the bad guys. And certainly when you listen to African leaders talking about it, that picture is not clear at all in their mind. They don't see it that way at all. They see a lot of positives to Chinese engagement in Africa, and they kind of they see the United States and Europe as kind of either holier than thou, a little bit hypocritical, and the Chinese in some ways as more honest. So the Chinese certainly are a growing force in development finance in particular, rather than in kind of ODA or grant-based finance.
My understanding is like on the loan term issues, I think maybe some of that has also changed over time as there's been sort of pushback, because I think in some cases there have been, I mean, one, it's quite opaque, right? There's not a lot of transparency. And so I have heard certainly from civil society organizations in African nations saying, well, we want to know the terms. What are you giving away for this loan? If we can't pay the loan, what do we get? And there have been some high profile examples. But I think you're right that in a lot of cases, this is the options, the financing option that they have to, build that set of roads or that infrastructure, which is something that, at least in recent decades, certainly the US hasn't done a lot of. But it is a really interesting example of how sort of different people are trying to portray things in different ways.
Yeah, I think honestly the Chinese might push back and say, "Hey, but you're talking about us being predatory lenders. Look at Wall Street. Look at the terms that are being offered by American banks. Those are pretty predatory. You guys are like payday lenders. Like that. This is how it's kind of characterized by Africans. I'm talking about this. That they don't use exactly this terminology, but the picture I'm getting is very much the same as the kind of the guys who turn up on a Wednesday saying, "Hey, your rent's due Friday. Why don't we lend you a few dollars and in exchange you give us 50% back next week?" That really like that they perceive the Wall Street's lending into Africa as very predatory indeed, and in some ways they're not at all clear that the Chinese are coming in on worse terms than commercial banks in European and American kind of major cities.
Also, I'll go ahead.
Jump right in.
One of the things I think is also interesting is that, the U.S. has characterized sort of the Chinese approach as sort of predatory, negative, that they're trying to, that it's not sort of a humanitarian kind of, vibe that goes into this, that they're doing this because they want to advance their military economic position. Well, now the U.S. is kind of saying, we're not there for humanitarian purposes primarily. We need this to be aligned with U.S. foreign policy. We need to, extract resources. All of these things have to be aligned with American commercial national security interests. So that argument that there were somehow, in some ways, Belt and Road, the Americans aren't going to replace it with something that big, but that that the approach is going to be, it's going to be more explicitly about advancing U.S. interests and not about kind of humanitarian principles. And I see that happening in parallel with, you look at the Gaza operation by the Gaza Humanitarian Front, which is sort of backed by Israel and the U.S. And this is a humanitarian operation which is very much aligned with military, national security interests. And you're going to probably see more of that, I think, with the Gulf in places like Sudan, South Sudan, where there are mixed, interests, where, the UAE may be supporting, the military government or the opposition forces in Sudan, and they, will become more aligned with their diplomatic, economic interests in those regions. I think, we're going to see a lot of that, stuff, humanitarian aid assistance, foreign aid, really instrumentalized in a way that is that's less opaque in a sense.
Yeah, I think I agree. Really, we're going to see. Firstly, I think unfortunately in the last few months in particular, the United States has squandered a lot of the moral high ground that it had built up, and I think unfortunately European governments have just said, "Oh, well, we've lost the checkbook. Sorry, terribly sorry." They're obviously under financial pressures from migration, from energy costs, from the war in Ukraine, and the European economy is under pressure from all sorts of directions, and they have notably kind of being willing to take a step back as well. And I think that inconsistence has been noted in capitals across the global south. So that's it for China. When we're looking at the Gulf donors, it does seem to be very much that they're kind of making a deliberate push to build up the soft power of the Gulf. We're seeing that in all sorts of different ways. They're buying up sports teams all over the global north. They're giving aid all to kind of key partners in Africa and the Middle East. They're obviously kind of decided that having built up this kind of wealthy position, that they can then use that to gain more leverage, and that soft power is a vital thing for them going forward. And this seems to, I'm not a Middle East expert, I'm not a geopolitical strategic expert, but it does seem to be that a rise in ODA and a rise in loan finance from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, one or two others, is very much driven by a recognition that they want to be more of a power in their own region.
Yeah,
And
it's also provided a lot of kind of political cover for a lot of the more nefarious things that they're doing militarily in the region, in Libya, in Sudan, and that sort of thing. So, and it's worked, I think, quite effectively.
I think that's right. And then the other kind of growing forces that we're seeing are, I mean, India. I think we have to, again, we have to expect, I think, that India is going to grow in power quite rapidly. If it has 1.5 billion citizens, its economy is growing fast. It's seen what China did and has said, hey, we fancy a bit of that. And I think we're still in the early stages of that. The Indian economy is still a fraction of the size of China's, but I would expect to see that change. And they are just beginning to think about flexing their muscles on the global stage in the same way. And the other major power thinking that way are the Brazilians. This is obviously the BRICS kind of group. But these are very large countries with very significant populations, and they've kind of identified that what China has said is once you build us to a certain level of power and influence, you can then use that power and influence to gather more power and influence, which is to a certain extent the United States model as well. And so they've kind of downloaded the Chinese playbook and they're running it kind of to a great extent, obviously personalized for the circumstances, but we're seeing some of those elements. So I think we begin to see a much more multipolar world there. And there was one interesting quote in one of the stories that we ran this week from an African leader saying, we've seen China and we've seen that growth and we've seen how their economic prospects have changed. And that's very aspirational for us. Can Africa get together as a unit and do the same thing? And it's interesting to me personally that Africa as a continent has more or less the same population as China and India. 30 years ago, I quoted this on a previous episode of this podcast, but I'll quote it again. All but 2 African countries were richer than China 30 years ago, and now all but 2 African countries are poorer. And Africa as a unit is obviously identifying how did China do that? By getting together, working as a unit, building up economic muscle and power. Can we in Africa learn some of those lessons?
Yeah, and I think there have been a number of sort of efforts, I think also with the South Africa leading the G20, but really to think about sort of how African nations can adopt a single position around certain things, and also the role of the African Continental Free Trade Area to sort of give it power and sort of bring it together and give it some of that heft or unity around policy or other positions that will allow it to sort of work in that way that you're talking about, or exert its influence globally in a different way. I wanted to also ask you, Dave, we had a really interesting piece. I mean, we've been talking a lot about sort of the changing aid landscape, but kind of a cornerstone of what we've written about over the years has really been official development assistance, right? And that's largely this grant-based assistance. And I think we've seen, obviously, in the US, huge cuts to that, seen big cuts throughout Europe. And we had a piece this week really looking at, is aid as we know it over? Is this sort of era of ODA over? And I'm curious what you sort of took away from that. And one of the things that struck me is that some of the experts quoted said, like, look, maybe some of the conversations on this are a little overblown. There's still a role, it's still going to exist, and there have been fluctuations in the past. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it was a really mixed picture here. Like at one stage, like the death of ODA was greatly exaggerated. It's kind of the message that's coming through. Even if so firstly, I think one thing to really emphasize is that the United States seems to have cut aid right to the bone. But actually, if we look at some of the figures coming out, that's not quite the picture that's being painted. Now, Avo, you're probably closer to what's the exact numbers that are emerging from Congress right now than I am. But as I understand it, we're still looking at a $40 billion aid budget for 2025 and maybe a $30 billion aid budget for 2026. Now, those are obviously lower numbers than we've seen in previous years, but they're still big. When we're looking at
there are some fundamental questions about how much will be spent, will there be the delivery capacity and all of those things, but there are still significant pools of money out there, and we don't know the exact numbers for fiscal year 2026 yet, and where those things will end up. And they are significant cuts, but you're right, it's not down to zero. And certain aspects, certain accounts seem, especially like on the global health front, seem to, at least in the House budget, come out pretty well and pretty close to even to what they have been in the past. So
yeah,
absolutely.
and there's a huge amount of uncertainty about this. We know that Congress has made a slightly more aggressive appropriation than the White House might have wanted, I believe, for 2026. And then obviously the midterms create a huge amount of uncertainty because fundamentally it's Congress that appropriates money for aid. And if we see more democratic control, then they may just try to ramp it straight back up. We don't know. That's all hypothetical. Anyway, but the point made is that ODA has been rising pretty sharply for a number, well, not sharply, steadily for a number of years, till we've seen far higher numbers than we would have done 5 or 10 years ago. And even if all of these cuts go back through and we lose 50 billion, we're really only back where we were in 2020 almost, because there were huge increases in aid over the course of the pandemic, and then following the war in Ukraine, these provoked huge increases in spending. So even if we see sharp drop-offs now, we could end up just back where we were a decade ago, which is hardly too alarming. So that's one way of looking at it. But then another way of looking at it is it does seem a bit different this time. There are some fundamental drivers, a lot of which we've touched on already, that are problematic for the future of ODA. European economies are in trouble. Now, it's worth noting that European economies are in trouble, but 15 years ago, European economies were absolutely booming. So we can't, and the fundamentals of those economies are relatively strong. So we can't be sure that European economies are going to remain in trouble. I hope they don't, because I live in one and I'd quite like to see the quality of life in my country improve. But we can see that European economies are looking at each other and going, are we sure we should be spending a bunch of money on helping people all over the rest of the world whilst we ourselves are struggling a little bit? The United States, it's much more ideological. They're saying we're not really sure that it's very isolationist. The United States has gone through periods of withdrawal from the kind of global architecture before, and then has decided to re-engage and kind of take a more dominant role. This appears to be one of those periods of withdrawal. So there's fundamental drivers that could be problematic, that could push a longer term with move away from ODA. And the other thing that's really interesting, or another thing that's really interesting, is the fairly muted reaction from African capitals to the United States making these cuts. There were some pretty loud shrugs from places like Nairobi when they said they were cut. Some Kenyan politicians kind of went out and said, well, why should the Americans give us anything, really? It's their money. They can spend it however they like. We'll get on with looking after ourselves. Thank you very much. And there is definitely a movement in the global south. It's hard for us sitting here to gauge how real this is and how much of it is bravado and hyperbole. There is definitely a movement to say, well, we'll stand on our own 2 feet, thanks. And then there's a third factor in this, which I think is really interesting, is that there were already a lot of questions about whether ODA was really the right tool to be helping people, about whether it was working very well. A lot of kind of question marks about whether it was being used properly. More ODA has been spent on tackling migration into Europe. More ODA has been spent on tackling climate crises. ODA has been diverted generally away from low-income countries towards lending more cash to middle-income countries on things that start to look a little less concessional than they have been. And there are a lot of people already looking at each other going, I don't think this system is working quite the way I would want it to, and maybe we should reform it. And we wrote a piece earlier in the year, which was really interesting, talking about if you were to accept that there should be significant financial flows from the global north to the global south, is ODA actually the financial tool that you want to be doing that? And people talked about kind of insurance mechanisms, like whether we should have one fund everybody pays into and then you withdraw from it when you have a climate crisis, when you have a refugee crisis, when you have a humanitarian crisis. Everybody should be able to access that. And sort of pooled grant funds and universal basic income, all sorts of different ideas. So it seems like an area, if I can sum up briefly a very long answer, it seems like an area that's in an awful lot of flux. And it's very unclear whether in a couple of years we'll just all go back to doing what we did before and all of this will be a storm in a teacup, or whether there will be some really fundamental changes to this order. And I honestly, today, have no idea which of those it's going to be.
And I think I would just say that one of the interesting things about where we are is that it, when you see these sort of reductions, it can actually force you to look at how can you make it work better? Because I think there's broad agreement that a lot of ODA is not maybe spent as well as it could be, or is it actually contributing to the type of economic development that's going to allow countries to stand on their own 2 feet in the way that most countries and people want to, right? And so I think it's a moment both of, kind of a pullback of resources, a shifting in positions of power, but also an opportunity to examine what's working and what's not. And so I think I have a hard time believing that maybe we'll go back to just same old, same old. I think it may come out a little bit different in the wash as we move forward, but you never know. Sometimes the status quo is easier to maintain.
I feel like that we should not underestimate the power of inertia here, and also the number of entities that have benefited from the status quo within and outside the government who are keen to pull us back to exactly where we were because it was working for them. I think one thing that this has really shown me is the prevalence of what somebody at Skoll described to me, a wonderful phrase which I've continued to use, as thanks, I guess, philanthropy, which is when you turn up as a foreign power and you say to an African government, hey, we're going to build you a hospital. And they're like, oh, thanks, I guess. Like, we didn't particularly want this. We didn't particularly need it, but you've given us a bunch of free money and we'll take it. Thanks so much. Yeah. Rather than engaging really strategically with the countries where the aid is being delivered and saying to them, what do you want? What do you need? What is your own strategy? How can we help with that? How can we give you long-term, predictable funding that you can rely on to build yourself a strategy to get you to an independent position? Instead, we're going to fund limited-term projects. We're going to fund short-term projects. We're often not going to tell you, the people who are running the country, what it is that we're actually doing. We're just going to contract somebody and hand out a bunch of cash to go to some city somewhere in the north of your country, and we're going to hand out and we're going to build something. And that is it will be interesting to see the extent to which that dynamic changes.
But I think in an environment where many countries are looking at the aid they're doing as how does it help me, that becomes also another point of tension, right? Is it about doing what's best in the country where you're giving the aid, or about what's best for the country who's giving it? And I think that it's always kind of a tricky dynamic, but could be in this political environment also a bit fraught. So I think we'll see how that goes. I think we're probably at time for the day, but David and Colm, thanks so much for this great discussion. Obviously, lots of fodder here for us to keep talking about, and a lot of issues that we're going to continue to track. Especially, I know, Colm, as we're, just a few days away from September and heading into the UN General Assembly season. I know that we'll be hearing a lot more from you on sort of all these UN issues. So thanks to both of you so much.